Hola a todos, pido desculpas, pues voy a cambiar a inglés. Se puede comprender español, pero hacer una presentación con esta es un poco más difícil. So sorry for that. So yeah, today I want to bring to you some relevant aspects that we have been developed in Latin America and especially in Brazil recently, and hopefully we can hopefully can bring some nice insights to all of you today. Yeah, so very briefly, I want to kind of introduce you to DNV. So DNV, it's the Global Assurance and Risk Management Company, which is completing 160 years in 2024. And DNV has a wide range of service from certification to advisory and several industry segments. And in offshore wind in particular, the DNV has a very strong presence. So DNV has been involved in more than 97% of the offshore wind projects developed in the world and has been certified more than 80% of those projects. So this shows how DNV is strongly connected to the offshore wind industry worldwide and also in Latin America. So just to give a number, in Brazil, we have been already assessing more than 50 gigawatts of early development projects in the region. Yeah, please, next. Yeah, so here's the content of the, oh my God, it's, it's, oh my. Yeah, so today we are going to present, given to you a little introduction about the marketing in Latin America and also what's going on specifically in Brazil, and also bring some highlights from the Scenarios report that was developed for Brazil in partnership with the World Bank and the Brazilian government during this past year. So I brought this map. Of course, there was some disclaimers here saying like how we target those countries as looking to developer or already developing offshore wind. So we have considered countries that already has some or even in the private sector already assessing the offshore wind potential, that is already discussing regulations, or even in the case of Colombia, for example, they are already launching an offshore wind tender for next year. And a couple of weeks ago, they already have pre-qualified 80 companies to bid in this auction that is going to happen next year. So Colombia is one of the most advanced countries in terms of offshore wind regulation and auctions for commercial projects in Latin America. And Brazil, it's also, there is a lot of things going on that I'm going to talk in the coming slides. Uruguay is also studying. So the development agents in Uruguay is already studying several areas for allocating for offshore wind projects in the future. And also Chile was very well present by Eduardo early today. But going through Brazil, what we can say about the market. So Brazil has been discussing offshore wind for a while. This is a map published by the environmental agency in the country, where we can see there are several developers already submitting the projects they aim to develop. Of course, this huge number, more than 200 gigawatts, we know that this is not a realistic number, but it's kind of an intention that the developers has, or their appetite of investment. But there are several regions where the developers are overlapping each other and these kind of things. The only thing in Brazil is that is slightly changed from Chile, is that Brazil has a very large continental shelf with shallow waters. So most of our potential, it's located on regions that we can allocate bottom fixed foundations instead of floating. But floating is also something very interesting in Brazil now, where the oil and gas companies offshore, they are studying how to allocate floating wind turbines to decarbonize the oil and gas operations offshore, because the offshore units, they require a lot of power, and nowadays they are using diesel to supply the energy for those units. So floating offshore wind can become a solution for decarbonizing oil and gas operations in the country. So there are a couple of oil players studying this in the country. So there are a lot of things going on. So the regulatory framework in Brazil is under discussion. So it's expected to be voted next week, actually. So this previous week, we have a committee, infrastructure committee in the Senate. The report was present, and they expect to vote the regulatory next week. So I will speed up a little bit to try to bring to you some interesting discussion about this report. So the World Bank has partnered with the Brazilian government and has released this study, which is called Scenarios for Offshore Wind Development in Brazil. So the World Bank has assigned DNV to execute the work, and I had the opportunity to be the technical lead of this report. And we have been working with the World Bank, with the Brazilian government, and several private entities, also public associations, universities, together to build this report in a couple of consultation phases, aiming to reach this report. But what this report is about? So we have divided in 3 main blocks, so regulatory and stakeholders, economic, financial, and technical. And we have assessed all those elements of the Brazilian reality and what is needed to be filled in order to develop the offshore wind industry. So this report has more than 300 pages, and it was really hard to assess each of those aspects for the country. So we can see supply chain, port and logistic, environmental and social, and even discussing about project bankability and all those aspects that are important to make a project or industry successful. And one of the main outcomes of this report was a list of 45 recommendations. So the World Bank delivered this report to the Brazilian government saying, okay, we have assessed all those aspects, we have identified all these gaps, and here's a course of action that we suggest. But there was a very iterative process during the report development. So the government was also part of this, I would say, writing process. So they were aware about everything we were researching during the course of the study, which lasts around 18 months to get ready. And I'll try to bring today just few slides about the report itself. So this is the offshore wind potential in Brazil. So we have 3 main regions where the potential is good enough, I would say, to develop offshore wind. Here is a grid map of the levelized cost of energy in different regions. And also it's divided by fixed and floating. So as you can see in the Northeast, fixed is mostly, it's the predominant technology, but in the South and the Southeast, there is a mix of fixed and floating potential. But this map is very nice, but there is a lot of other factors that need to be taken into account. So we did a very comprehensive geospatial analysis considering environmental and social existing infrastructure, ports, grids, other economic activities like offshore and gas, pipelines. There are a lot of things going on in the sea, or a lot of things that people want to develop in the sea. So offshore wind needs also to coexist with this other industry, these other activities that are in the sea. So this geospatial analysis helped us to identify what is actually the most suitable regions with less impact. Based on that, we have defined 3 growth scenarios. So the study has an horizon of 2050, and we have identified 3 different scenarios called base case, intermediate, and ambitious. And the whole report, we discuss about what if for each of these cases, and we try to identify what will be the challenges and the consequence of reaching these installed capacities. So here, a very nice slide with some dense information, but try to summarize as much as I can. So this first chart is one of the main I would say, discoveries we had during the report. So we got all the historical hydropower in Brazil generation. So hydro is a big thing in Brazil. And we have overlapped with simulated offshore wind to see how the generation profiles of hydro and offshore wind complement each other. And the graphic was looking like this. So that was a very nice surprise to see how offshore wind can actually complement the hydro generation in the country. And also we keep studying and we research about a comparison between onshore generation and offshore generation. So as you can see, we also realize that offshore generation is also more stable. So you can see the curves, and offshore they are more flat than onshore wind. So these are some conclusions that we were reaching during the report development that help the government to understand, okay, why offshore wind? What are the reasons? How much? And these kind of studies, that was the first, that was the key objective of the World Bank, trying to clear most of the questions that the government had at that time. Another aspect, it's environmental and social. So we have been assessing several topics. So not only protected areas, but bats and birds, artisanal fishing, aquaculture, tourism areas, ports, everything that could conflict with offshore wind. And we are overlapping all this in the entire Brazilian coast. So you can imagine how difficult this exercise was, as the Brazilian coast has more than 80,000 kilometers length. So this is one of the outcomes of this study as well on the environmentally social part. And finally, a little bit about port assessment. So there is no offshore wind without ports. So port is a key thing for offshore wind. And we have been assessed also the port infrastructure, what is missing, what requires improve. So storage area, bearing capacity, handling capacity, all those technical aspects was evaluated for a lot of ports in the Brazilian coast. So these are some studies. This one is the one that I mentioned for Brazil, but the World Bank did the same for Colombia 2 years ago. And another document that's quite relevant for offshore wind, it's called Key Factors for Successful Development of Offshore Wind in Emerging Markets. This document is really good, and it provides very interesting insight for emerging markets in offshore wind like Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and others. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thiago, for sharing your experience in Brazil and in Latin America. There's time for a question. Si alguien tiene una pregunta que la quiere realizar en español, no hay problema, le ayudamos con la traducción si hay algún inconveniente.
Thank you, Thiago. How long did it take to conduct all those studies, and who financed?
Thank you very much for the question. So the study took 18 months, 1 year and a half to be completed. And who financed it was the World Bank through the ESMAP, which is Energy Sector Management Assistance Program. So they financed that, and they assigned DNV as the consultants company to execute the work.